Hi guys, and welcome to a completely new type of video on my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the case of Estelle Mouzin, who is a 9-year-old girl who disappeared in France back in 2003. It was a huge case in France. It still is. Probably, I would say, just as big as the Madeleine McCann case, but I feel like it's not very popular or well known in the US or in the UK. So this is a case that happened only 30 miles from where I grew up in France, so I definitely remember when it happened, and I wanted to discuss this today, and hopefully you will get to learn more about a case that I think isn't talked about enough. The disappearance happened in Guermantes in Seine-et-Marne, which is just east of Paris, in the suburbs of Paris. I've done as much research as I possibly could. A lot of it had to have been translated from French to English. If I forget anything or if I get anything wrong, please let me know down below. Aside from that, maybe grab yourself a cup of coffee. I hope you enjoy the video, and let's get started. On January 9th, 2003, 9-year-old Estelle Mouzin leaves school with 2 of her schoolmates. It's dark, it's cold, it had snowed previously that day, and they walk all the way up to a bakery where they then say goodbye to each other and then go their own ways to their respective homes. A lady passes Estelle in front of the bakery between 6:30 and 6:45, and she's only 400 meters away from her house. She doesn't have a lot to go, but when her mom comes home from work at 7:30 and notices that Estelle still isn't home, she gets worried right away. Her older sister Lucy, who is 16 at the time, is already home, but her mom wastes no time and starts calling around to make sure that Estelle hasn't stayed behind with a friend. Maybe she's somewhere else in another house. Now, something to keep in mind is that Estelle's parents were already separated at the time, with a very unusual custody arrangement. Estelle's mom, Suzanne, had custody of both girls, while her dad, Eric Mouzin, had custody of Arthur, the son. And he lived on the opposite side of Paris, about 60 kilometers away, so not that close. It's not like he lived a few streets away and Estelle could have just gone to her dad's instead. She does call him immediately just to let him know that Estelle hasn't come home. And although they don't really get along, they do love their children very much, and he is worried instantly. He just knows from the beginning that something's very wrong. Once she knows for sure that Estelle is not with her friends or with her dad, she goes to the local police station to report her missing. The search begins immediately. Luckily, there was none of that 48-hour. Sometimes police officers will say you need to wait a certain amount of time before you report a child missing. I do believe that in the first few moments of the mom contacting the police, they considered her to maybe be a runaway child, but she was 9 years old. It was January, it was really cold, it was really dark. She'd just come back from school. She had no reason to be a runaway. She wouldn't have had any money. Surely you would, if you wanted to run away, you would at least stop by the house to pick up a few things. I don't know, they kind of dismissed that theory straight away, which is good. So they immediately started looking for her. The flyers were made and distributed very quickly after her disappearance. If you do go to France, and even if you have heard of this case before, you will absolutely recognize her picture. If you go to France, even people who weren't invested in the case will know her name if you show this picture, or will at least know what she looks like if you mention her name. That's just how widespread the flyers were. I remember them popping up quite quickly after she disappeared, and I was 30 miles away from where she disappeared, which is, I guess, not that far, but it's not that close. And they were everywhere. And I think the smart thing the parents did, or at least the dad did, was to distribute the flyers to truckers or people who would travel quite a lot as part of their job. That way the flyers would reach a wide region in France, just to spread the word, since this didn't make any sense. She just vanished. On Saturday 11th, only 2 days later, her dad made a statement and confirms the situation to be a kidnapping and not a runaway situation. He states that she is not a runaway. She is full of life. She is the definition of joie de vivre. He then addresses the person who could have kidnapped Estelle and begs them to please let her go free. So many people came together for this search. Divers, police, firefighters, a helicopter was involved just from the get-go, just to look for her. You really can't say that they delayed the initial response. Quite a few cases, you'd think you would have gotten the answers if only they'd made more of an effort earlier on, but they definitely deployed every single measure they had to try and find her. And on Monday, the 13th of January, so just 4 days later, they did have a man in custody who has been described as a sexual maniac, but he was very quickly released. Not long after, they organized a search party of the neighboring woods, including the military. Over 130 people were participating in this search. They were looking for the local woods, anything in the area. I think by that point, they were already potentially looking for a body. As tragic as it sounds, it's well known that after 3 hours, the chances of finding a missing person alive are very low, and the odds only decrease over time. The investigators did obviously start by looking at the family, including the dad and obviously the mom, because they did go through a separation. They were keeping different kids at the house. It just seemed like an odd custody arrangement, and it's not the first time that a kid goes missing because one of the parents wants full custody, or maybe they're jealous. They did look at the dad for quite a while, but I think they quickly realized that the parents had nothing to do with this. They were looking for other usual suspects after that. Mainly people who've had a history of targeting younger children, or maybe a history of kidnapping. They also were really relying on receiving tips from people, and they pretty much got nothing. I guess because it was January, it was dark. It is a bit of a small town, and there weren't that many people outside, but you would think that between the bakery and her house, only 400 meters, someone must have seen something, but pretty much no tips came through. I think the vast majority of people who know about this case, when they initially saw the broadcast of her disappearance on the news, got the impression that she just vanished into thin air. She was just passing that bakery, saying goodbye to her schoolmates 1 minute, and next thing you know, she was just gone, with absolutely no idea where she could possibly be. What's fascinating is because they had so few leads, they actually just shut down the entire town she was from, Guermantes. They shut down the entire town, blocked the roads, searched every single house, just to see if they could find a clue, but also to make sure that she wasn't being kept or held hostage or maybe hidden somewhere in that area. They also contacted Interpol to try and get satellite images around that time of the crime, but nothing came back. A few months later, with still no leads or any idea of where Estelle could possibly be, a French artist named Charles Couture wrote a song about her, named Estelle a disparu, which means Estelle has disappeared.
Estelle a disparu, on a tous vu cette affichette avec le sourire figé d'une fillette. Jamais.
It's a really nice song, but it's also a heartbreaking song. It's a song that talks about how we all recognize her from the pictures, but we have absolutely no idea where she is. And I think it really shows just how many people were invested in this case. She was only 9 years old. She couldn't have possibly been affiliated with the wrong people. I mean, she's she's the poster child of innocence. And because her picture was everywhere and it was pretty much the same picture used, you just end up feeling like you knew her. Like you know this girl, you've seen her everywhere. And I think everyone could relate to a certain extent. That could be someone's sister, someone's daughter. I was only a year older than her when she disappeared, and I remember being absolutely terrified that this could happen to someone walking home from school, especially seconds after she said goodbye to her friends. And I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that she was 9 years old, she just disappeared, and none of the adults could figure out where she was. That was absolutely terrifying to me, and I'm sure it was for a lot of kids her age, and also for a lot of parents who had kids her age. It's also incredibly frustrating to know that from the get-go, they really used every single tactic. They've used every single, they've done everything in their power to try and look for her. I mean, they closed down the entire town. They had divers, they had an army search the woods. They didn't waste any time. They searched from the get-go. This was back in 2003, and they've done everything they could. The fact that they did everything they could and still found nothing seemed just so disheartening. It wasn't until 6 months later, in June 2003, that police released a composite sketch of a man who had been involved in a kidnap attempt 2 weeks prior. Now, the incident happened all the way in Belgium, which was about a 3-hour drive from where she lived, which makes you wonder why, of all the composite sketches or incidents to have happened, why would they look into this? I think it's partly because they had no leads, so they'll look into anything, but also because one thing to know is 2 weeks before Estelle disappeared, similar kidnapping attempt happened in her own town. So I think they made that connection. Unfortunately, the composite drawing was not very distinctive. It didn't have any distinctive features. It really didn't help advance the case. And I think another thing to note is that unfortunately the drawing looks a lot like her dad, only because it's basically the drawing of a man. It didn't look like anyone in particular, but unfortunately it does happen to be quite similar to her dad, which didn't help because he's been so involved from the beginning to try and look for her, and someone came out with this drawing that just looks like him. However, only a month after this sketch was released, they did end up arresting the man whose sketch was based after. He was arrested in Belgium after a string of failed kidnappings. His name is Michel Fourniret. To give you a little bit of background about Michel Fourniret, he was born April 4th in 1942 in the Ardennes, which is a gorgeous region near the Belgium border, quite close to Luxembourg as well. His upbringing is said to be working class. He has an older brother and an older sister, although his sister does pass away in 2002. And of all the research I've done about him, the first thing that popped up was a comment he had made about his sister, which I think says a lot about the type of person he is. He says that he had been very shocked by watching her defecating in a bucket. He stated, and I quote, "For me, a woman does not defecate. It's degrading. It does not live up to the image of the Virgin Mary." Quite a lot to unpack here. I'm not sure how old he was when he saw this, but it definitely marked him enough that he mentioned this when he was an adult. His dad was a blacksmith of some sort. He was never really present for the kids, and he was also described as an alcoholic. However, he did end up divorcing his wife, whose mental health was declining, and he ended up with full custody of all 3 kids. Michel was described by schoolmates as a thief and as a deceitful person, and some have also said that when he was a teenager, that he would jump up and down in excitement after doing perversive little stunts. So, starts early. Now, this might get a little complicated. I'll make it as easy as possible, but he gets married for the first time in 1964, and he has his first child with his first wife. A few years later, in 1967, so 3 years later, he is sentenced to jail for assaulting underage girls. As a result of that, his first wife files for divorce, as one does. 3 years later, so 1970, 3 years later in 1970, he marries again, someone else. He marries a second woman, who I'm wondering, I'm assuming she knows exactly, I'm assuming she knows he went to jail and why he went to jail. I'm not quite sure. I couldn't find any information about that, but surely someone would mention that they've been to jail. I'm not sure. He has a son with the second wife, then twin girls, so 3 kids. So he's on to 4 kids now, 2 wives, 4 kids. And then between 1966 and 1973, he gets sentenced for voyeurism and violence. In March 1984, he gets locked up for a dozen of assaults and rapes of minors, and 3 years later, he begins a 7-year sentence, during which his second wife divorces him. I mean, I guess it's bad enough that she married him in the first place, but once he was sentenced for raping underage girls, she was like, I guess it's my cue to leave. Just a little recap. Marries once, has a kid, gets arrested, goes to jail for assaulting underage girls, She divorces him, meets someone else, has a son, twin girls, and then over a couple of years just gets sentenced to jail for more lovely things. And then in 1984 he gets locked up, and then in 1987 they announce the 7-year sentence that he needs to serve. Now next up is just something absolutely wild. He meets his third wife, Monique Olivier, in jail, like while in jail. Through one of the newspaper ads. He put an ad in the newspaper. He wrote, "Prisoner would like to correspond with person of any age to forget loneliness." And I'm guessing Monique was reading the paper one day and she was like, a sign. I must respond to this. A real catch. After a couple of exchanges, she starts visiting him in jail. She knows exactly why he's in jail, by the way. This isn't like, oh, he's innocent, she doesn't believe he's innocent. She knows exactly why he's in jail. And I think the worst part is that he only ended up serving 4 months of the 7-year sentence. He gets let out early for exemplary behavior in 1987. I had to read that a few times. So technically he went to jail in 1984, and then in 1987 they say there's a 7-year sentence he needs to serve. But I think because he's already done 3 years in jail between 1984 and 1987, they're like, fine, we'll let you out, you're a great prisoner. So he gets let out October 1987. He moves in with her in Yonne, which is, I apologize to people who live there, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. They have a son together in 88 named Selim. And then July 1989 they get married. Now within those 2 years quite a lot happened. So leaves jail end of 1987, moves in with Monique. The following year they have a kid, and then the following year they get married. However, his first kidnapping, followed by rape and murder with his wife's assistance, was committed less than 3 months after leaving jail and after having moved in with her. So straight out of jail, they're committing crimes together. The victim's name was Isabelle Laville, and she was only 17 at the time. After that, the couple moved back and forth between Yonne and the Ardennes, where he grew up, while committing multiple rapes and murders. In 1988, the year she has their son, they moved to Flouen, I think I'm saying that right, near Sedan, where Michel grew up. So she was committing crimes with him while pregnant. And then to seal the deal, they got married the year after. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. Over the years, he gets into more trouble. He gets back into contact with an old cellmate. For the sake of this video, I'll try and keep the facts centered around Estelle Mouzin, because this is not really a video about Michel Fournier, but I guess you could make a whole, probably 10-episode documentary about this guy. Fast forward to 1991, the family moves to Belgium. Still close to the French border, still close to the Ardennes, but they moved to Belgium officially. Now let's go back to 2003. Estelle Mouzin disappears in January. In June of the same year, less than 6 months after her disappearance, Michel is driving around in his car and passes 13-year-old Marie Ascension on her way to school. It didn't say if she was going to school or coming back from school, but she was just taking her usual route to school, which is very similar to how Estelle was kidnapped. She was kidnapped on her way back from school. He uses the same ploy as for the other crimes, and he tells her he's looking for the school. So she points him in the right direction, but she refuses to get into his vehicle, to which he responds, "It's not nice to not trust people," which unfortunately convinced her to get into the car with him. And she wasn't even halfway in when he grabs her, ties her, and throws her into the back of the car. About 10 kilometers later, at an intersection, she manages to open one of the back doors and escapes. Someone nearby managed to help her out, and after speaking to police, they came up with the composite drawing I spoke of previously. Now, because he was living in Belgium at the time and this kidnap attempt happened in Belgium, they didn't immediately, they didn't know his background in France, but it didn't take them very long to figure it out. So when they did find out what he'd been convicted of in the past, they decided to look into all of the recent missing children cases. He was interrogated for a whole year and he was about to be let go when his wife Monique cracks under pressure. To be fair, I think she'd been interrogated about 120 times. actually 120 times. And she reveals part of her husband's past. At the time of Michel's arrest in 2003, French policemen who were working the case, Estelle Mouzin's case, came to question him in Belgium, but there were no indicators that he could have been involved. One thing that was noted was that about an hour after Estelle Mouzin's disappearance, a call was made from Michel's house, like from his landline, because it's 2003. A call was made to his sons, which means that he couldn't have been in her area at the time because he lived in Belgium 3 hours away. To me, that's just a little bit crazy because it doesn't mean he made the call. The wife could have made the call. And also the craziest part being that when they do speak to the son, he recalls no such phone call, which makes me think this whole alibi is quite weak, but the wife, Monique, does confirm that he was with her that night. Now, obviously, I think at the time, the police didn't understand that she was so involved in the crimes with him, but she did provide him with an alibi, and they just kind of took it at face value. It is quite frustrating because they did so much to look for her. In the beginning of the case, they literally did absolutely everything they could, and then they finally have someone who could fit the profile, but the wife says, nah, he was with me, and they're like, okay, all right, I guess it's someone else. In 2006, a prosecutor provided vital information to be added to Estelle Mouzin's case, mainly regarding to the fact that Michel Fourniret's personality was compatible with the kidnapping. I did see online that some of the investigators thought that Estelle Mouzin was not the type for Michel Fourniret because in all of his other crimes and all of his other victims were slightly older than Estelle. She was a bit too young for him. So that's part of the reason they weren't too interested in him. He did seem to fit the pattern, but not quite enough for them. But they did find a VHS tape recording of the news broadcast of her disappearance, and they also found pictures of her in his home. Now that doesn't mean he did it, but like that's starting to look really fishy. I guess, yeah. It's just odd. Like, even if you're really invested in a case, like I'm not gonna record a broadcast or print any pictures and then keep them in my house. It's just so odd. The most chilling part being that his wife confessed to the judge that as they were watching the news broadcast of her disappearance, he smiled and said, "That one's not me." So, in October 2007, Michel Fourniret writes a letter to Éric Mouzin, who's Estelle's dad, saying he would like to speak to him while also saying that he has nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance. But he says he would like to speak to him father to father. He also sends a letter to the Ministry of Justice saying, "Judge me for all the cases, it will be easier. Judge me for Estelle Mouzin and for other cases he's involved with." Which is something he seems to do a lot. He seems to never implicate himself, but he's also okay with them just locking him up for everything. They're like, fine, just blame me for everything, but I'm not telling you what I've done. It kind of seems like he doesn't want to talk about it. Maybe he just wants the punishment without having to go through the confessions, or maybe he's just taunting them, saying, yeah, get me for everything, but I know you can't because you don't have the evidence. Estelle's dad refuses to speak to him. He wants nothing to do with him. He does not want to hear from him. He only wants to hear back from the court. So he, as involved as the dad is, I think he doesn't pay attention to the court or the statements made in court by Michel Fourniret. He just waits for the verdicts. He's trusting the justice that they'll get to the bottom of it. In 2008, Michel Fourniret is sentenced to life with no possibility of parole for the murders of 7 young girls, and his wife, Monique Olivier, is sentenced to life with a minimum of 28 years for being an accomplice. Now, a few odd leads that did happen after that. In 2009, there was a picture posted on an Estonian porn site with a girl that looked a lot like Estelle Mouzin. Like, the resemblance is definitely there. She seems to be a bit older. I believe they think the girl is 16 in the picture, but the facial features are just very similar. However, that picture happened to have been taken the year of her disappearance, so it couldn't possibly be Estelle. And I think the father did mention he was surprised when he did see this picture because he had already accepted that Estelle was dead. I think if you had provided him with evidence that Estelle was still alive, he would have been very shocked. Another lead was from the owner of a Chinese restaurant who claimed that he found bones during construction work, but he didn't know if they were human or animal bones, and he just went along with the construction. And I guess that was enough for the caseworkers to just tear up the whole restaurant and look for those bones. And they turned out to be dog and sheep bones, which is good news and bad news, obviously. You want an answer, but I guess it's good news that it's not someone else either. And as good as it is to have leads that keep the case alive and that keep the case going, it's just so disheartening to get your hopes up and then you're let down when it leads to absolutely nothing. Now, while Michel and Monique were under investigation for all of the other murders, they did search the house and had found white lace shoelaces and black gloves, and Estelle at the time of her disappearance had been reported to have been wearing white snow boots with white laces and black ski gloves. So in 2010, 7 whole years after Estelle's disappearance, her parents' lawyers asked for those to be tested for DNA. Now, I'm not sure if they ever did test those for DNA, but I know in 2013 they did test the DNA and the hairs found in the back of his car, and none of them matched to Estelle. So that was another dead end. And then in the same year, 2010, Monique and Michel agreed to get a divorce. And in 2015, she admits that the alibi she provided for him the night of Estelle's disappearance was a fake, and that he wasn't with her at home. But this confession wasn't official until she reiterated it in November 2019. So this is something she said in 2015, and for whatever reason, that wasn't an official confession, I believe. So until 2019, they still had no idea that I think everyone kind of assumed it would have been him. 2 months after she admitted to this in 2019, so I think it's beginning of 2020, she confirms that the phone call made from their house was made by herself as per her ex-husband's request. She also added that Michel had gone to that area a few days prior to the kidnapping and came back declaring he had found a lovely little subject. Which to me is so wild. Like, I can't imagine my husband leaving for a few days and coming back saying something like that, but you have to remember she's in on this. She knew it from the get-go. She met him in jail. She responded to a newspaper ad to meet him. So she was absolutely fine with this, and she covered for him for so long. On March 6th, 2020, he confessed to the murder of Estelle Mouzin. That is 17 years after her disappearance. That's such a long time to wait. His wife later confessed that he had kidnapped her and brought her to Ville-sur-Lume, which is another town in the Ardennes, to rape and strangle her. On the 21st of August, 2020, partial DNA was recovered from a mattress that was in Michel's sister's old house. That was a mattress they seized back in 2003, linked to other murders he was involved with. Now, bear in mind, his sister passed away in 2002, so I think they just used her empty house to commit crimes and just used it to do whatever they wanted. So the sister had absolutely nothing to do with this, but they did use her house for the crimes they committed. He was initially nicknamed the Ardennes Forester because he used to lie to police and tell people that he was in, I think, husbandry or forestry. And then the name quickly changed to the Ardennes Ogre, the Ardennes Killer, and then the Ardennes Monster, which is a very fair nickname, but I think people forget that Monique was just as involved as he was. Now, to talk a little bit more about the confession time back in March 2020, Sabine Kéris, who was the judge at the time for this case, was the one who managed to get him to confess. She did an outstanding job. On the first day, he didn't seem to want to confess to anything. He'd already been sent to jail for life for 7 other murders. He wasn't about to provide any more information about anyone else. He just doesn't care. This is not someone who regrets anything he's done. He started by saying, "Your Honor, I've got nothing to lose. If I've made a stupid mistake, I'm happy to pay for it." However, the next day, after showing him a picture of Estelle Mouzin, he admitted that it's possible that this picture makes me uncomfortable, and I recognize here a being that is no longer here because of me. The judge then asked him to tell her more, to which he responds, now this is a little bit tricky to translate because I'm not sure if he says the kidnapping of a being or the removal of a being, as in the removal from this planet. But let's just see. The removal of a being is a mighty blunder that no one is proud of. That's as close as, that's the closest translation that I could come up with. But what a thing to say. Like, just way to pick the words. That's just absolutely appalling. And when he was questioned further by the judge, he said that nothing sparks any memories of the event. And he would just kind of tease the court by saying, "This does remind me of something. It does speak to me. I have the feeling that you're on the path to the truth." He then insists to be brought back to Guermantes so he could jog his memory. The judge does tell him, "We're quite happy to bring you to Guermantes, but how are we going to know that you're going to actually help us?" To which he responds, "You have in front of you a man of good faith who isn't trying to bamboozle you." I mean, I don't know if he just thinks the judge is stupid or if he's just being cheeky on purpose, but it's actually infuriating. Like, it's just unbelievable. And then towards the end, she did say, "Why don't you want to remember? Are you trying to protect yourself?" But he never responded to anything like that. I'm not sure if he was pretending to not try, like, I don't know if he was uncomfortable and didn't want to try and remember, or if he was just pretending that he could remember anything and try to tease them, saying, "Oh, well, no, I just don't really know what happens." If you can remember your sister shitting in a bucket when you're 5, surely you remember what happened when you kidnapped a 9-year-old, even if it was 18 years ago. That's just absolutely shocking. Like, I don't believe for one second that he's forgotten this, whether it's on purpose or not. One of the most insane statements he has ever made was that his victims' families should thank him because after having raped their daughters, he murdered them, sparing them and their families from a life of trauma, which is not only absolutely fucked up, but also wildly incorrect, since he caused even more trauma for the families now that their daughters are gone, especially the ones who still haven't been found. I mean, this is someone who can't be saved. Like, this is someone, I feel like locking him up isn't enough. His biggest regret is said that he couldn't have married a virgin. So again, I think that feeds into the theme of why he was kidnapping younger women or younger girls. He refuses to tell the court or the family where Estelle is, claiming that he doesn't remember. And like, I know he knows. Like, I don't know, I've never spoken to him, but I don't believe for one second that he doesn't know where she is. They are still looking for her. There were searches just a few days ago, and they are going to keep looking for her, but he's lived in quite a few places. There's also his sister's old house. It's not just one place that he was at. And they also have been searching this castle called the Château du Sautou. That's a tongue twister. Château du Sautou, which is where he lived for 2 years with Monique back in the late 80s. But it's like 32 acres of forest. They did find 2 bodies in 2004 from 2 girls that he had murdered. So that's why they're thinking maybe Estelle is there as well. So they're still looking there, but it's quite a large area to cover. If you're wondering how someone like that could afford a castle like that, even if it's, you know, not downtown Paris or anything, it's still a very expensive castle. Now, the reason why they could afford that was because at the time he was linked to a robbery. So from what I've read, there was a treasure that was hidden by some robbers that he then stole and then bought the castle with that. So that was in the late 80s. They lived there for 2 years. I don't know if he still owned it or something. Maybe he sold it after. Money laundering. There were more searches last year at the end of June, and there are more searches going on this year. And I really, really hope that we can find her soon. I mean, it's been long enough. If there's any news, I will stick you a post down below just to provide an update. Now, over this case, you can hear quite a lot about the dad being involved in the searches. I mean, he's done so much. He started an association, he's written a book, and you don't hear so much about the mom. And it's just two opposite reactions to something traumatic like that happening. The dad wanted to be involved, wanted to get to the bottom of this, kept fighting for his daughter. And I think it was just too much for the mom. I think her way of coping was to just step back. She doesn't want to know what happened to Estelle. She doesn't want to imagine. Like, I can kind of understand that reaction as well. That doesn't make her a bad person. There's still, I mean, you have to remember that Estelle's a victim, but her parents are also victims in this. And her mom ended up being so traumatized by what happened to Estelle that she moved abroad. Although I must say she did question the dad's involvement in the beginning for quite a while. But again, as you can understand now, that the dad had absolutely nothing to do, and he's done so much. Every year on the day of her disappearance, there is a march in her honor. They also planted a cherry tree in her memory. Now, the dad does not want to follow the Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier case. He's not interested. He's only cares about his daughter. He's worried that over time people are going to end up talking more about the murder duo than his daughter's story, and he hates that, which I understand. And in January 2021, so just a few months ago, he, on the 18th anniversary or 18th year of Estelle's disappearance, he did a radio interview where he says, "What I imagine is Estelle's terror during the entire trip between Guermantes and the Ardennes. It would have lasted at least 3 hours. I imagine the anxiety, the terror, and the horror of the situation. I think I will be able to partly move on once we find her." Now, on another sad note, I don't know if you remember Michel Fourniret's second wife. He had a son and then twin daughters. In 2006, the 20th of February, one of the twin daughters committed suicide. She could no longer bear to carry his name. It was just too much for her. Michel and Monique's only child, Selim, has begged for people and journalists to finally leave him alone. He has since changed his last name. He's moved abroad. He wants nothing to do with his parents. And I think he's just trying to move on from being the son of arguably the biggest serial killer couple in France. I didn't include any pictures of him. I mean, he is a victim as well, and I think it's just the right thing to just let him move on. To end this on a more positive note, in 2018, Eric Mouzin said, "Estelle's disappearance could have broken us all. However, over time, it seems to have strengthened us." At home, Estelle is still with us in her own way. A painting, some pictures, her laugh are everywhere, sprinkled around the house. We did not want a mausoleum. They preferred to erect a totem sculpted in a cedar tree, which is planted in their back garden, and every member of the family is represented by an animal, each connected to each other. And at the very top, held by a guardian angel, a star, Estelle, which I think is just such a lovely way to honor her memory. It's definitely a heartbreaking case. Like, I think about her a lot. She's just a year younger than me. She would have been 28. It's just absolutely heartbreaking, and although I'm happy to finally have the answer and to finally know what happened after over 15 years of just nothing, it's still heartbreaking to know that we still haven't found her. He still won't tell us where she is, and I feel like this case is so big in France, but outside of France, maybe people aren't so familiar with it. So I hope me sharing this case with you just helped you learn a bit more about Estelle. And if you like these types of videos, please like, subscribe, comment down below if you have any other cases you'd like me to talk about. I plan on doing many more, but I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.